Hi everyone, my name is Ari Kim and I will be one of your on-camera, just a chat style conversation we're going to have about your questions regarding MCAT and studying through this summer. So I'm pretty excited. We've got a lot of excellent questions coming in through the chat already, so keep them coming. We'll do our best. We're joined by Preston, who's going to be on camera here, and then we also have a couple of instructors off camera that will be answering your questions in the chat. So many people to help you figure things out. If you have any specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out anytime. But yeah, you guys all had some really good questions. We'll do our best to kind of incorporate them as much as we can. But if it turns out that I missed your question, I do apologize. Post it again. It might have been that the chat kind of scrolled a little bit fast there. So let me know when you can that you can see and hear us okay, because it's important that you're following along live. That's a benefit of a session like this. I can answer your questions and we can answer your questions live. So make sure the little red button is clicked on and you're able to view the session live as well. Yeah, so you see the chat? I'm watching the chat, just making sure. You guys all see and hear me okay? You could type in MCAT. If you see and hear me okay, go ahead and type in the word MCAT.
Or your favorite color.
That too. Sometimes I ask purple, but I have nothing purple around me right now. While we wait for this, you just heard. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, I'm glad somebody hears me.
Someone's out there.
So here we have Preston. Preston is an excellent instructor I've worked with for a good number of years, and we're here just to try to talk shop, honestly, to talk about the questions that you all have and some of our own best practices and tips that we can share for you as you kind of embark on this couple of months of studying ahead of you. So I guess a little bit of background about me. I'm obviously an MCAT instructor with Kaplan. I teach both on camera and off camera. I do a lot of content development work, so I know a lot of the ins and outs about how the AMC likes to test specific kinds of questions and how passages are constructed. Background-wise, even pre-Kaplan days, I did a PhD in biochemistry a good number of years back. And so I approached the MCAT not pre-degree, but actually post-degree after having done my PhD, and then I was at home with my kids, and I felt like I wanted to kind of pick something up and do something, I guess, with my science background, not necessarily research-wise, because I think it's a challenge with a value. And who knows about that is Preston. So I'm gonna pass it over to Preston. He'll introduce himself.
Guys, I'm so excited to be with you all, and I'm so excited to be with this team, all of our great off camps, and with Ari, who you guys should know is, I believe, the world's foremost expert on the MCAT. I might be exaggerating, but she is, but probably not by much, because she is a Kaplan legend. She said she's developed a ton of our curriculum. She really knows what she's doing. She's fantastic, as are all of our off-cam instructors that are with us. So I'm just excited to be here, be part of this team. Me, a little bit more about me. So I'm an MD PhD student, actually. So I'm just a couple years ahead of you guys. I've been teaching. I took the MCAT actually like 5 years ago, almost to the day. It was like the end of May 2016. So it makes me old. And I'm currently working on my PhD in immunology. So I am a grad student by day and a Kaplan instructor by night. I teach MCAT off camera. I also tutor students and coach students. And what else? So yeah, as Ari kind of alluded to, I also have a family, got 2 little girls. And so when I'm not an MCAT instructor or a grad student, I'm dad. And it's awesome. And it keeps me busy and mostly out of trouble. And it's a lot of fun. But I'm excited to talk about your guys' questions and how to help you guys go through what both Ari and I, went through once upon a time, which was prepping for the MCAT, and balancing the rest of life with it, right? Which is a lot of fun and a real challenge, but it's good. So.
Great. Okay. Let's take a look at some of the questions that you guys, I've been trying to do my best at gathering some of the questions. So The chat only scrolls up high enough. So
yeah, they got a ton of good questions coming.
Yeah, so many good. So I've been trying to like copy paste them. So the first question I wanted to address was studying. So there was a good number of questions that was like, you know, I've been reading, right, whether it's Kaplan books or really any of the other resources out there. I've been reading through books. It's kind of boring, or I'm not retaining. It doesn't seem all that useful. What tips do you have about reading through the Kaplan books and studying for the MCAT that way? What do you think, Preston?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. What we talk to students about all the time. And I feel like one of our challenges as instructors, I don't know if you feel this way, Ari, but a lot of times it's pulling students out of the books. Because I think as undergrads, we get used to this mindset of I just have to read about it and I have to memorize it for the next, hour before my exam or whatever, and go in there and put it down on the test. And the MCAT is a different kind of test because you need to know a lot, but you need to be able to think with a lot. There's a lot of critical thinking involved in the MCAT. And so, we see based on your poll you guys are pulling in, we see about 60% of you are planning to only use a prep book. And I'd really encourage you guys to find some practice questions and other things to supplement that, because you need to be able to apply and practice that knowledge. It's not just about what you know, it's about how you use what you know and practicing that thought process. Super important, just absolutely critical to MCAT success. So, and what that also does is that encourages long-term learning, right? If you just read something, you're going to forget it. If you read something and then you have to think about it and then you have to, produce that information and recall it, then that builds your long-term learning and your memory. So that expand your resources, I would say, and look for some practice questions, and don't just read chapters over and over and over again.
The analogy I like to use with my own students is, because I love analogies. I don't know if you know that about me, but I do all the analogies when I teach. The analogy I like to use with that is, like with any new skill that you're developing, the one that works really well is thinking about learning languages. Like when you're learning languages, do you go and read a dictionary? Is that the best usage of your time? It is a usage of your time. I'm not going to lie. You'll get stuff out of it. Are you going to retain it though? Are you going to know how to use that information? No, it's just going to be a bunch of facts that have no context or connection really to anything. And the MCAT is not really just a science content test. It is based on science, but it is much more interested on the application of content. And how do you learn how to apply words in a language when you're learning it? You immerse yourself, right? You go visit a country, you go find a buddy who speaks that language. Are you going to feel good about it? No, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to feel stupid, and that's okay. A part of learning is putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, and really kind of forcing yourself to try out the words. What are use of the books then? I'm not saying books are useless. I really want to emphasize that books are super useful, but that's not the first thing you should try. Just use it as a reference, right? So let's say you go do, I don't know, 20 questions on like optics, for instance, and I'm like, oh, I don't quite understand how this magnification equation works. I don't know what those numbers mean. Go back, read up on that part of the book, because you have then a goal or a direction, and then go back to the questions, look at the explanation, try to make sense of it all. Because if you do practice directed content review, it's going to ingrain in your memory a lot better. And then you're naturally going to be understanding how it's going to be tested on the MCAT. So don't just read books. Honestly, it's like, 72 chapters of book material. If you're using the Kaplan, what are the chances you're going to remember the stuff in chapter 1 of the first book compared to the last chapter of the last book? None, zero. So don't do that to yourself. You're going to feel terrible. You're going to forget everything. You're going to be like, that was a big waste of time. So really do your best to try and incorporate practice while you're learning as best you can.
Yeah, I like telling my students the books are an encyclopedia, not a novel, right? You don't read through an encyclopedia chapter after chapter. It's not a novel. There's no cliffhanger at the end of chapter 3. There's nothing that says you have to read the chapters in order, right? So use it to go back and look up things, like Ari was saying, is a really powerful way to use those books. They're super important, but they're not a novel. So use them to look up tools and questions and clarify as needed.
Great. Another really good question that came up, which makes a lot of sense if you're coming to this event, you're looking for tips on studying through the summer, was about courses and resources, particularly things like the bootcamp program. Now, the reason why I want to bring that up is because I help run the bootcamp program for Kaplan, and it's a very immersive experience. You know how people learn how to new language by essentially just flying to a new country and then surrounding themselves with people who only do that? That's kind of like what boot camp's like. And it's exhausting. I'm not gonna lie, but it works really well. At the end of the program, we don't have specific official, results to kind of cite for this, but anecdotally, I will say that a whole bunch of our students will increase their score, but they're living and breathing MCAT. You can't really have a job. You can't have any other type of commitments. It's really hard if you're still taking other classes at the same time. But if you are like, this is my make it or break it, I have to take my MCAT at this date by, and there's really no other choice, that is definitely a program that I would highly recommend. And I could go on and on about all the different features of it, but feel free if you have any questions about that. Consider maybe booking an appointment above to talk to an instructor or another teacher about some more of the details, and we can get some of that information. So good question. In terms of like outside of the bootcamp, is it that you're doomed if you don't take the bootcamp program? No, you can certainly do well with the courses. In fact, Preston is somebody who also does a lot of our courses, our online courses as well. So Preston, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the courses are fantastic, and that's what most students use, right? Most students don't go through the boot camp, although if that fits your needs, we recommend it. But the courses, they've got all kinds of offerings to match your schedule. So and that's not just times of day, right? That's if you want to go once a week, twice a week. I think they have some that even go 3 or 4 times a week. And so a lot of you probably have other things going on right now. Jobs, research, volunteering, maybe some travel, whatever, right? And that's awesome. And so you might look at those classes as a great way to fill in that schedule, find something that meets your needs, and look at where your test is. And the thing with the classes is they're going to give you all the tools that you need to be successful. And they're going to give you access to tons of resources. It's not just the 12 3-hour sessions, 3 12-hour sessions. That would really be something. No, 12 3-hour sessions that are your actual online instruction. You get access to Kaplan's QBank and their MCAT channel, which is hundreds of other hours of instruction. And the books and all the AAMC resources, and the list goes on, flashcards, and I'm sure I'm missing others. So you get all these great resources that you can pair, that you can use, that you can play with. And so we recommend students find a class, depends on your needs. And again, you can talk with the counselor in the link up above. For most students, they want to finish their class about a month or maybe more before they actually test, because that class is going to give you all the tools. And then you're going to need the time to practice them, implement them, brush up on some things, and fully prepare yourself for your test. Ari, did you have some other thoughts on that?
I think that ties in a lot with scheduling questions that I've seen come up a lot is, how do I work that into, my specific timeline? I 100% agree. Don't book a test date right after the end of a course if you plan to take one. Give yourself at least 4, maybe 6 weeks even, to really make sure that you have a lot of practice, tests, because it's really hard to actually make use of all of those other resources while you're still in class, because it's, there's all this like homework stuff that you got to get through, and that's really just like one layer of content. You should never really kind of consider your first pass of content the only time you do it. You're going to layer and do this often, and that also kind of speaks to a question I saw a little bit earlier about priority. Like, are the topics on the MCAT equally weighted? So what do you think, Preston?
My sense is no. So, and there's actually a breakdown on this. They've done this, right? Like your Chem Phys section, right, is 20. So you have 4 sections, each are equal, 25% of your test. But like within Chem Phys, and I don't remember all the percentages off the top of my head, but like 25% is like biochemistry, right? And you're like, but there's a biochem section. You're like, yeah, it's in Chem Phys too, right? And so that makes biochemistry actually more important. Then something like organic chemistry, I think is only like 10% of the chem phys section. So if you hate OChem, you still need to know some for the MCAT, but it's not your biggest section. But actually psychology is also one of the more heavily tested because it makes up the majority of the psych-soc section, which is 25% of your exam. So a lot of students don't realize that. So students sometimes get pigeonholed into thinking, well, OChem and physics are the two most common ones. These ones are hard. I have to spend more time studying these. And you do need to study them. You do need to know them. But those are actually the two smallest sections of the test. And then within each of these disciplines, some things are more important than others. Like amino acids are probably like the single highest yield thing on the MCAT. Like you gotta know your amino acids inside and out, right? And then you get like metabolism, which is important. You're gonna get questions on, but isn't nearly as high yield as amino acids, and is frankly a lot harder to study. So if you're pouring all your time into metabolism, thinking this is really hard, I don't know this, you're investing a lot of time into something that you're gonna get relatively fewer questions out of. And so you need to be strategic and balance what are the areas of both greatest yield on the test as well as my greatest need. Because also if you're an expert in amino acids, it doesn't do you any good to just keep studying them just because there's a lot of them, right? So you need to balance your areas of need with their relative weight on the exam. And it's a tricky balancing act, but it's something that as you do practice questions, it's part of why you got to do practice questions. You start to get a sense for where those strengths and weaknesses are, what things keep coming up that you keep missing. And then you can go to your encyclopedia, your book, your MCAT channel, whatever other resources you have and drill into those and really perfect those areas of weaknesses. That's when your score starts to increase.
Great. We spent a fair amount of time talking a little bit about science content, but we've not really mentioned the one section that people maybe don't like as much, and that's going to be cars. So,
come on, people love cars.
I mean, I feel like it's like a dividing line because some people really love it and some people really don't like it. And I do find there was a couple of questions about like, what do I do if English is not my first language? How do I incorporate that? What are some tips there? And I know we spoke about this earlier, so I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit about some of the tips you might have about trying to amp up your car skills.
Yeah, guys, you've got to read. Like there's no way around it, right? So in our course, we teach specific strategies for cars. So while you can't study content for cars, there's a ton of strategy that you can pour into cars. But it's not just about reading. It's about reading strategically and learning how to do that. But honestly, especially if your test is a ways out, you're thinking, I'm going to test at the end of summer, maybe you're testing next year or something, just reading, finding good reading, and reading that's a little bit more intense than Harry Potter. Like I love Harry Potter. I'm not here to bag on Harry Potter, right? But go find some reading that's argument-based, right? That they're presenting arguments and discussing merits and conclusions and things. And as you start to understand, get used to reading that level of literature, then the cars section is going to be much easier. And that's true also if you're not a native speaker, and maybe especially true if you're not a native speaker, is you've just got to let your brain read a lot. Like Ari was saying, you're learning a new language, in this case, literally, right? And an MCAT language on top of that. And you just have to immerse yourself in it. So I think that can be really valuable. But yeah, there are tools and tricks that you can be practicing with cars. And I always encourage students to dedicate at least 30 minutes every day, their MCAT prep, to cars practice, whether that's passages that they're doing with questions or even just reading good literature.
In particular, I really think not just, you might be like, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by not Harry Potter literature?
Right.
What does that even look like? And I think,
is there any other literature? I don't know.
Nothing but Harry Potter. So I think what you want to be looking for are opinionated humanities and social sciences articles. So if you have access to like the online resources at your school library, a lot of them will have magazine subscriptions, and that's actually one of the big places. There's like you look, just maybe Google things like arts and literature, and that will bring up a lot of the same style of cars passages. So that is like, honestly, both Press and I agree. If you are embarking on the aspect of studying for cars, or not studying, but like practicing for cars, it's really important. You just got to throw yourself in there, get acquainted. if English is not your first language, have a dictionary handy, maybe look up some of the words, but also kind of like pause and think. I think a lot of us default to thinking, oh, it's a scary word, I don't know it, I'm a bad student. I want you to think, can I use context? Can I caveman that word down? Sometimes I'll ask my students, is that a good word or a bad word? Does that have a positive or a negative tone? And usually that's enough. Like, it's not even that you need to know that word in order to understand the passage. They just throw it in there, kind of filler wise, honestly.
And one of the secrets to CARS is, like you were saying, a lot of them are these kind of humanities-based essays. And when they take these, they often take just like a chunk out of the middle of it. So it's like throwing you in the deep end, right? Like you sometimes don't even have all the context. And so one of the secrets of CARS is you want to understand the passage as well as you can, but it isn't always necessary to have a perfect understanding of the passage to get the questions right. Your purpose in taking the CARS passage is not necessarily to become an expert in that topic. It's to get the questions right. And so the better you can understand the reading, the better off you are in doing that. But there's a lot of practice that goes into how do you quickly make sense of arguments and know how to quickly go back to the passage for the right information. And that's something we teach in our courses. And frankly, that just takes practice, being able to figure out, how do I get to the right answers given this information? That's one of the things CARS is actually kind of testing you on.
Great. Yeah, so CARS, it holds a special part of my heart, not because I love it, but because I recognize that it is purely skill-based. Like learning how to ride a bike is learning how to balance, learning how to paddle, learning how to time, all that. CARS is nothing but a skill that you can learn. Some people kind of approach that thinking, I'm bad at reading, therefore I'm going to be bad at CARS. I feel like a little self-fulfilling prophecy going on there. But I think if you approach it as this is just a thing I got to learn how to do, it does seem a little bit more abstract, but it is learnable and doable. People can get good at CARS when they're not good at it initially. Just it takes a little bit more effort and more conscious practice and review, but it is certainly doable. So I don't want people to feel like they're limited because they're not inherently good at it, or they don't have the background for it. It's very much a doable skill. It's learnable for sure.
Yeah, and it should be part of your summer study plan, right? So we're talking about how do you study for the MCAT this summer. Make sure that you develop a plan to address CARS, right? Because as Ari is saying, you can get better at it.
There's a couple of really good questions coming in about, now I see the one about EMT, but I feel like it's not specifically like, I need to know specifically how to do this with an EMT course or certification going on. But I guess the broader question is, how do I balance MCAT studying with fill in the blank? So work, family life, school, whatever else is going on there. How do I do a good balance?
For me, part of it starts with knowing when you want to test. So you know how much time you have, right? And then I think planning weekly is huge. And setting goals. So plan to plan, set aside time, 30 minutes a week or something, a regular time when you can look ahead to your week and say, okay, I've got, X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank, like I said, whatever it might be. They're on these days. And then you can structure your studying around there. You can see how much time you have to study. And then you can set goals and prioritize, right? So you go, okay, I've got 20 hours available that I can study this week, and this is when it's going to happen. And these are the areas of my greatest need. So this is how I'm going to address them. And the idea being that you can then look both across the week and across your entire summer and say, this is what I need to get done this week, and this is what I need to get done this day in order to get all this done this week. You can make goals and you can plan that way. And the idea being that when you sit down to study at whatever time, whatever day works, you know exactly what you're studying, you know how you're studying it, you know what resources you're using, you know all these things, and you know what you're going to accomplish in that time. So that when you get to the end, you're meeting your goals and you're not just sitting there going, well, it's MCAT study time. Let me just pull open random book and find something to read or whatever, right? You're not just shooting in the dark, just studying, finding MCAT stuff to look at. Like you're knowing what you're doing, why you're doing it, you're prioritizing it appropriately. I think is really the key to any study and scheduling. So whatever you have going on in your life, however much time you happen to have, if you can prioritize your time, your resources, that's going to maximize your efficiency.
Makes sense. I think the idea of prioritization is not just important here, but it's life importance. So
Sure.
I think at some point though, you're going to hit upon a block, not a block, I guess, maybe more like I'm stretched to my max. You know, I don't even have time to really think anymore. I have no free time whatsoever because I filled all of my blocks with things. And while I will comment separately on don't do that to yourself because that's really your poor brain. The second thing I will say is that I think a lot of us might have preconceptions about the timeline. So I think a very common expectation I see of students coming into studying the MCAT is like, oh, you know, I had a friend who did it for like, studied for like 2 months, and they got a great score. So, you know, or the other thought is, I'm a bad person if I can't get it done in 2 months. Like I'm just not worthy of being a pre-med if I can't study and get a 525 in 2 months. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because with regards to my own studying, I had done a PhD in biochemistry, which I'm going to be honest, I know a lot about one enzyme. That's what my biochemistry gave me. You know, a lot about choline to cell transferase and its 3D structure. I knew nothing else. So you got to take that into consideration first. And then secondly, I had 3 kids after that and no science review whatsoever. So by the time I had started studying for the MCAT and I was looking at content, you know, that was MCAT like, so first, second year college science undergrad courses, that was 15 years of a difference between those two. So for me, I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know any of it. I don't even think I actually learned it. Or if I did, I don't think I learned it well. I was not a great student back then. So I think if I had approached that saying, well, I really should, you know, I have a PhD, I really should only take like 3 months to do that. And I tried that out and I failed, I would feel really crappy about myself. But I decided because I was like, yeah, I've learned a little bit of wisdom, just a little bit of wisdom along the way. And it wasn't that I am forced a timeline. I decided this is my goal and I can only study for like an hour or 2 after the kids are in bed. But the thing with kids, and Preston knows this, is they wake up again. So you really only have like a small budget of time.
Ari, I'm thirsty.
I gotta pee again.
Yeah.
And kids. So I only had a really small window of time to study every night. So for a lot of you who are like, I just don't have the budget in there, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna be able to make up, you know, magically create newer time. There's no faster way of getting content into your brain. But you're gonna want to be giving yourself a little bit of grace and saying, okay, maybe 3 months is just not a feasible thing for a person in my circumstance. And that's okay. That doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you a less worthy future doctor. That is just the reality of why it works the way it does. It took me a whole year, team, whole year of studying. And I made a lot of mistakes in the way. And I always remind my students, don't do the things that I did because I learned from that experience. But don't put yourself in situations to set yourself up for failure. Okay. So think about you. I mean, you're going to dissociate yourself a little bit, but think about you and you know, you are now advising you as a friend. Is that really a good idea to do? Given where you're at and what you need, is that a good idea? If it's a no, don't feel bad about extending and pushing that deadline so that you give yourself a bit more breathing room if you just don't have the time to study, okay?
Yeah,
I had another question. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think especially right now, with the COVID craziness, you can take advantage of that a little bit because the AMC has suspended most of their, I believe still, right? Their rescheduling fees. And so there's even more ability if you find that you need more time, you can push back and make sure you give yourself the time to do it well, right? That's not uncommon. We see that frequently with students. So don't feel like you failed. That's dare I say normal.
Oh, it speaks to my heart. Eleanor's got a question about being a non-traditional student. There's no way I'll be able to take every single class before my test date. How can I compensate for some of the higher level classes that I won't have taken before the MCAT? What do you think, Preston?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it comes down to resources. You've got to surround yourself with good resources. And a little bit to what Ari said before, let yourself have the time that you need, right? If as much as you can, but the better you can surround yourself with resources, because the thing with your classes is you sit in on, name your class, physiology, psychology, physics, level 3, whatever, right? And they're going to cover way more in that class than you probably actually need on the MCAT. So if you haven't taken those classes yet, you can get around that if you have good resources. So this is a place where those review books might be really useful to you. At Kaplan, we've got the MCAT channel. So if you've got a channel that teaches that, you can dive in and get a lot of information there. And then honestly, part of it is just opening up practice questions on it and letting yourself make mistakes and see what is going on in that subject and what the heck you're expected to know about it. Because you're going to open it up and it's all going to seem like Greek to you, right? Unless you speak Greek, and then it's going to seem like a different language. But it's going to seem like a language you don't know. and that's okay, right? And so let yourself get acquainted with a little bit. And then a common mistake, and this applies broadly, is that students think when they take practice questions that it's an assessment, that they have to get them all right. And that's just not true. Take practice questions as a learning tool to teach you what things you know and don't know, so you know what things you need to go and study more. I think that's especially true for if you've got a newer discipline. You need to see how that discipline is tested and what things are high yield and what ideas are common in that discipline, so that when you're trying to teach it to yourself outside the context of a course, and you're looking through all these resources, you can pull out what's useful from those resources and what things you really need, and give yourself that framework a little bit in that context to really learn the discipline.
I think to also follow up on that, I get a lot of students who burn through a ridiculous amount of practice in a relatively short period of time. And they're like, nah, my score didn't go up. I'm like, I don't think you actually learned anything from what you did there. All you did was just like do a bunch of problems and expect that to magically kind of like
clicking letters, right?
Yeah, so I mean, to that point, we're not saying you should hold yourself to some sort of standard when you do the practice. It's okay to make mistakes. We make mistakes all the time, I promise. What it becomes a waste of, though, is when you don't learn from it. So you do a set of practice, but budget a ton of time for the review. The more you don't know that topic, the more time you want to budget for the review. And that's what we mean by doing studying through practice. Like, you're learning the material by doing those questions. You're looking at something, you're like, I have no context for what even this means. Don't feel bad about opening up your books, okay? Don't feel like you have to know how to answer questions on a content topic you've never really seen before. For the comment from earlier, for the student who was like, I haven't even taken some of these courses, do your questions open book. The questions are meant to help you learn. It's okay. If you know a bit about it or you know some foundation, obviously then put your books away and do your best you can there. But if you are new and it's a little bit intimidating doing practice-centered review, do it open book. I promise you, open book or open Google or whatever makes the most sense to you. Okay?
Yeah, I tell students that same thing, especially early in their study. Like, a really clear example is physics. Students will be like, oh, I don't have the equations memorized yet. And they get to this physics question and they don't do it because they don't have the equation memorized. And I'm like, just look up the equation and let yourself think through it, right? Because that's what the MCAT wants you to do. It's think. You'll learn the equation. That'll get memorized by test day, right? But don't rob yourself the opportunity to think through a problem and to learn from it because you, quote unquote, don't know it yet. It's not an assessment. It's a learning tool, right? That shift in mindset is really important generally for MCAT studying.
You know what's really funny is the more I work with instructors, the more we recognize we just all say the same thing.
That's true.
And it's not like we talked about it ahead of time. It's just that's how often we work.
It's like we've worked through enough students to like all see the same mistakes.
Possibly.
And probably made those mistakes ourselves when we were students.
Absolutely true. I have certainly made those kinds of mistakes.
For sure.
It was
you know which guy spent too much time reading in the books? This guy.
And me. I kept my books. Not my books, my notebooks. The ones I filled out from cover to cover. It's not one notebook. It's a stack of notebooks. Guess what I did? I rewrote the textbooks, team. How useful was that? Not at all. That was 4 months of my life I will never get back, as I rewrote textbooks. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do it. It feels really good. I felt like I was doing something. I had something to show for it, but it was nothing in here. It was just all on the paper. There's a couple of questions about how to work through it. So I guess if we've addressed the idea that you really need to be doing studying around content, well, how do you, not around content, around practice for the content, how do you even arrange that part? So I know that, countless, schedules as floating around online about do these chapters in these order this way. So what do you think? Is it worthwhile doing one book? And so being very methodical and organized, doing all of orgo and then chem and then physics. What do you think, Preston?
That's a great question. And this is not my area of study per se, but as I understand learning science, frequent repetition is more powerful than a single binge. And so one of the things that I did when I was studying, one of the few things I might have done well, is I would look over, topic A on Monday, and then Tuesday I would look over like topic B, but I would quiz myself and do practice questions on topic A. So what I'd studied the day before, right? And then I go through and I recognize what things I missed and still don't understand, and then I can touch those again on Wednesday, right? So like in a single day, I'm both reviewing or learning topics through various means. I'm practicing them, but a different topic, and then I am addressing mistakes I made of like a third topic. And so what happens is I'm seeing multiple things across multiple days, and I'm letting myself have a chance to move that into longer term memory because I'm seeing it across spaced repetition. And so I think something like that, now it doesn't have to look exactly like that, right? But I think, if you're like, okay, this is physics week. This week, I'm just learning physics. That's nice. But in 8 weeks, how much physics are you going to remember if you haven't seen it again? Probably nothing. All you're going to remember is the biochemistry you covered last week, right? And so in my opinion, mixing it up that way, giving yourself a little bit of everything, I think helps you learn. I think it also keeps your brain a little bit more fresh, because I think you get a little bit bored seeing the same topic for an extended period of time. At least I do.
Nothing drains my soul more than having to do a topic I don't like for the whole time I'm sitting down.
It's like nothing feels more intimidating than like, okay, it's Monday morning, and you got to do like, name topic you dread all day. You're like, I'm gonna go watch Netflix, right? Like, what's on YouTube today? Hello, Twitter, right? It's just like boo, boo, boo. So yeah.
Good question. So a lot of our students do struggle. I think a lot of you guys are in the boat of studying for an exam that is a couple of months in advance. I did notice from the polls, it was like August is a very common test date here. But for a lot of you who are maybe testing relatively soon, I totally understand the idea that you're losing focus, you're getting super anxious, you can't think about anything other than the MCAT, which is not all that healthy. So what do you think? Do you have any good tips to share with our students with advice for how to prevent burnout? Or if they are in burnout, what do I do with this?
Take a day off.
But Preston, I can't.
I know, it's so hard to take a vacation. Come on, guys, I'm giving you permission. Go take a day off. If you're at the point where you're so stressed out and you're burnt out that, it's all that's on your mind, you're not learning anymore. And quality is so much important than quantity in terms of study, right? It doesn't do you any good to put in 80 hours a week if you're just burned out and you're not remembering any of it. You would be much more benefited putting in even just 20, 15, even 10 hours a week if that time is really well spent, right? And everything that you get out of there is meaningful and increasing your score. So for general burnout, like I tell students to take a day off every week and fill it with something fun, right? Go do some activity or something that rejuvenates you a little bit. your hobbies or whatever, things that you enjoy, your friends, social life. You need that. Your brain needs that. And you can fit that into your spaced repetition too, right? You can give that time for your brain to digest that material, and then you can come back to it and give yourself that opportunity to try and remember it the next day. And that's useful. That's good too. If you're really in the throes of being burnt out, sometimes depending on when your test is, how much time you have, I sometimes tell students, and they're all going to think, no, I don't have time for this. I've told students to even take like a whole week off before. I've had students that were so burnt out that I was like, you just need to not study this week. And they come back and their studying is so much more effective the next week. And sometimes that gives you the clarity to see like where you're studying well and where you're just spinning your wheels and what things you can change. So I think that time out is really important. So yeah, you don't have too much time to not give yourself a meaningful break. The other thing, if I may just add on to that, you need to take good breaks through your study day as well. It's not just taking a day off, right? Like you can't go like 10 hours straight and not have a break in an entire day. So like give yourself things to look forward to at the end of the day, whatever it might be, a game, a favorite TV show, a bowl of ice cream, I don't know. And give yourself meaningful breaks. You know, it's okay to stay for 3 hours, take 10-minute breaks on the hour or so, and then give yourself like a whole hour off. Go get some good food, take a walk. Your brain needs that time to recharge because there's kind of a law of diminishing returns. And if you're just going, but you're just plateauing, you're not doing anything, then you might as well stop. You're going to get just as much progress done. In fact, you're probably going to get more because when you come back, you'll be more efficient and more effective again.
So just to be clear, going and eating your lunch while watching a MCAT video is not a break. No. Sleeping is not a break. Commuting.
But it is important. Is important.
Yeah, none of that stuff. What I'm trying to say is like, don't just study all your waking moments and eating moments. Don't fill it with everything. You need, your brain isn't, and we're not just doing that because it makes you feel better. We're doing that because learning science tells you you diminish in efficiency so much if you don't schedule breaks in regularly. So if you're like, I can't stay focused, I keep drifting off. I have actually another kind of piece of advice for that as well, but you can't be just pushing yourself, because that might work for like a day or two, maybe a week, but you're gonna plummet and you're gonna end up even more backwards.
It's a marathon, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't sprint it.
Yeah. So there was a question a little bit earlier that definitely spoke to me with regards to motivation and staying focused and on task when you do have that set of time. So let's say you did all the right things. You did what Preston said, and you've got a block, you've got a task set aside for it, you know what you're going to do, but you just can't get started. So one of the things that I've been working on with my students that I'm super excited to do again, actually tomorrow, is that we've, for our our students in our courses, we've created I don't know if you guys know about Slack, but Slack is like, a lot of workplaces use this these days, but it's essentially, it looks very much like Discord if you're familiar with that. But it's just like, a place where people can post questions and, talk to their peers or, get some advice or maybe talk to a teacher. But one of the things I like to do that is honestly useful just for as me as well as my students is I hold study halls. Now the study hall, the way it works is kind of Pomodoro style. So we all jump into a Zoom room, and then I set a timer for like 45 minutes. It's not a big chunk of time, but I also make people turn on their cameras. So you're not just like sitting there on your phone, right? I can actually see people. Not that I'm sitting there watching you. I have my own things to do. But in study hall, you come with your own little task and you do that diligently for the 45 minutes. And it's much more likely that students will actually go ahead and do the things set aside for them because they know they're sitting and doing this. At the end of 45 minutes, I say, okay, timer's up. And I invite people to come on camera and microphone, and we just like chit chat. I learned all sorts of cool things about students last week. We could talk about whatever they were studying, whatever, where they live, things like that. So I really like this idea. And it doesn't mean it has to be just through a course. Consider if you've got a couple of pre-med friends, schedule study dates like this. I think as things open up, what I was trying to think of is this would be a great way to replace things like study sessions in libraries, or maybe hanging out at your local Starbucks and studying. That might not nearly be as possible depending on where you live. I live in Canada and the restrictions here are crazy. We're still in lockdown actually. But I thought this was such a good way of incentivizing students to stay accountable and on track. I got so much done during those 2 hours, and it wasn't even that long of time. But all the dev work I had planned, I got done during that time, and I was really happy with both myself, and the students were all super happy about that as well. So consider doing that to help you stay accountable and motivated. Keep yourself accountable to your friends as well, right? It doesn't even have to be they have to be pre-med friends. If you guys are just like generally studying for things, they're in different majors, say this is what I'm going to do, and you can ask them to tell you what they're going to do as well.
Not the quality, right? Not the quantity. Yeah. That's quality studying. Yeah, like I said, it could be a roommate, significant other, parent, friend, whatever, dog. I don't know. Whoever holds you accountable.
Another good question that came up, going back to the whole like practice versus reading thing. So what is the good ratio of reading versus practice?
That's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on the topic, because I think something like, for me at least, something like physics, man, I could read about physics all day in the textbook and it's just not going to mean anything to me, right? But I go do some practice questions and it clicks and I see how they ask and I understand what the equations mean and how to use them, and it works really well for me. Whereas something like maybe psych-soc, while my practice questions still play an important role, I'm going to spend more time studying them maybe out of books or flashcards or other things, and then using questions to find my gaps in my knowledge, right, and fill those in and to expand my knowledge and kind of solidify my understanding, my memory. So I think it also depends a little bit on how comfortable you are with the topic, right? But generally, I would say, like if I had 10 hours in my day, just because 10 is a round number, this would be a lot to study a day, right? But I might spend like 2 to 3 hours like reading or studying otherwise, right? Whether that's like reading out of a book or watching the MCAT channel or do whatever, like just learning content. And then I might spend another, maybe depending on the topic, maybe 2 hours or so, 2 to 3 hours, maybe about equal time, doing practice questions, seeking those out. And then with the rest of that time, you're like, Preston, that doesn't add up to 10. Like, how did this person learn how to teach MCAT? He doesn't even do math, right? It's because math is easy on the MCAT. Anyway, that's a separate topic. But the rest of that time, and it's going to seem more like review, but but that's the review time, right? Like that's the time that you're reviewing your practice questions. So I don't know if you want to lump that into practice question time or review time, because it's kind of a little bit of both. But it's that self-analysis, right? And that's kind of that other third is I would say. That time is really important. And depending on how comfortable you are with the subject, that could take twice as long as actually doing your questions or more. But if you're really comfortable with it, then the topic, then it may be much less time. So it depends on the topic, depends on how comfortable you are with it. But those are kind of the 3 sections I break it into. And I wouldn't, if you're doing like 80% like just reading content studying, like 20% questions, I'd say that ratio is probably off, right? Like probably need more practice questions than that, right? And more time doing that.
I think if you've got evidence, based on, and here's the thing, it means that I want you to start with the practice. Start with a practice and see how you do. And if you have no context for it, then go do the big digging, right? Sometimes that actually might end up being that you end up reading a chapter. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay. If you don't know that content area, or it's been like years since you last saw it and you really do need an in-depth refresher, I guess I just wouldn't put the time limit on content review if the practice tells you that. If you are just wholesale doing that right from the get-go, then that's where you're going to start losing time and efficiency. So do the practice and don't put a ton of boundary or limits on understanding the concepts. But I guess I want to emphasize this is that, when Preston a little bit earlier talked about spaced repetition, I also like to view spaced repetition as building layers of knowledge. So let's say, here's a good example. You know, I tell my students not to actually memorize the steps in glycolysis. And here's why. It's because if you ever do any questions on metabolism, they don't really ask about that kind of stuff. They might ask about some of them, but it is more important for you to know what's it for? Like, what's the net reaction in glycolysis? Where does it occur in the cell? How come, red blood cells only do glycolysis? Like, what is the reason for that? Those are much more testable in the context of the MCAT. On occasion, you might get questions that ask about like the rate limiting steps or the irreversible steps, or even a structure of an intermediate. That's possible. It is technically testable, but it's not very likely to show. And a little bit earlier, Preston said, you could dump so much time into memorizing glycolysis or any of the metabolic pathways. And what we're saying is don't start there. You might end up there, but that's certainly not where you should be starting. So you build layers of knowledge and you use the practice to decide which details to add to it. So it's important to do a little bit of review of and organize, right? So make sure like you've got like a little, I don't know if it's a mental category or an actual physical box or a binder that's got stuff that's grouped together, and build in regular review of the stuff so that you're not just looking for new things and forgetting the old things, but you're regularly coming back to all those details that you uncovered. It's going to fill up so much of your time. The more and more forward new content review you do, the more and more backwards retrospective review you also need to build into your schedule. So don't just do new things. Make sure you're heading back to the old things as well and build in that spaced repetition that Preston described.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that comes back to, there's a reason we ask students to start with a diagnostic exam, right? Your studying isn't efficient until you know where your strengths and weaknesses are. And you don't know where your strengths and weaknesses are until you've done a certain level of practice, right? And so like Ari was saying, once you get in there, you'll see pretty quickly like what subjects you really need to dive in and spend a little bit more time just working on. And I think that when you're doing those practice questions, that also works as a kind of review, both retrospective and practice for things that you're still learning. They both count. But yeah, the better that you can self-reflect and self-analyze on the practice that you've done, the more efficient your studying will be, because you'll know what things you need to be working on, how much time you need to be spending, and what resources you need to be working on them.
Great advice. There was a couple of more specific things coming into the chat about like things like, how do I analyze data? Or do you have any tips for math? And I wanted to speak to particularly the one about the figures. So one thing that we do in our own classes is actually we've developed strategies for different kinds of passages. The one that is usually very blaring and very different, I think, are the biochem experimental ones. So it's the one that's got acronyms everywhere, letters, and you have no context for what they mean.
Alphabet soup.
Yeah, alphabet soup. That's exactly, somebody said that earlier actually today when we were talking about it.
So fun.
And there's just like error bars and then scatter plots and lines, and it's so overwhelming.
You're panicking because you never studied which enzyme was it? The collagenase. That I didn't know anything about that, right? Because you'll get that
glycogen.
Right.
Yeah. I have no idea what any of these things are. I don't have a degree in that field. And it feels kind of like you got to know that stuff ahead of time. It doesn't seem feasible to be able to analyze that information in such a short period of time. But I want to know, Preston, if you had any quicker tips, I guess, to get started on the analysis of data. Because honestly, Preston does this for a living.
Yeah. And it's, yeah, something like that. Well, I'm just going to leave that one there. But yeah. Yeah. So one thing, okay. So a couple of thoughts. When I get into that alphabet soup, one of the tricks that I use is I rename them, right? Like they'll give me some like substrate and it's got like Greek letters and numbers in it and it's not even in English and I have no idea what it's talking about. Like I'll just call, okay, this is not protein A, right? Or compound X or whatever. Because that just lets my brain simplify it, right? I'm not overwhelmed by these new words and ideas. I don't care what they call it. It doesn't matter. I just need to know the very basics of what it is. And you need to be able to connect that to principles that you know coming into the MCAT, right? So if it's like a protein, you don't need to know anything in the details about that specific protein, but you need to know a little bit about protein structure, maybe enzyme connects, depending on the kind of protein it is. And so I'm looking for familiar things that I can connect it to. I'm giving it an easy name. I'm looking for familiar things to connect it to. When it starts to come to the actual data and the data analysis, you've got to look at the legend, right? And the name of it and the axes, like those simple things, right? But you'd be surprised how big of a difference they make and how often students forget that, right? So like when I look at a graph and a figure or whatever, in a passage, I'm not necessarily trying to decipher all that information in one sitting. What I want to know is what information is here, right? Does that make sense, that difference? So it's not just, what is all the information, like what are all the details? And I just want to go, okay, this is giving me the results of this experiment and this is how it's presenting it. And then if a question asks me about that experiment or the results, I can go back to that figure and then I can start to go, okay, what's really showing me, and I can break that figure apart. I can figure it out. But if I know what the data is and how it's presented, and I can get that usually just from the figure, the legend, the axes, as long as I know where the information is and what the information is, then I can, if I need to, I can go back and really dig into it and figure it out deeply. And then the last little tip I would offer is sometimes, not always, depends on the passage, but it's not uncommon. Sometimes a figure is repetitive with what is said in the text. And so sometimes if one doesn't make sense, the other will to me, right? So sometimes I'm like reading and I'm like words, and I'm like, what the heck? And then I'll see, oh, there's a figure. And the figure just draws it out and makes it all make sense for me. Beautiful, right? Or sometimes vice versa. I'll have this figure I don't really understand, but then there's an explanation of it in the text that helps it make sense. So just keep an eye out for those, because sometimes the MCAT's a little repetitive that way.
Great tips. And it aligns really well with some of the strategies that we have for what we call distilling passages or grabbing the major takeaways from it. I'm not going to lie, the analysis of those experimental passages will take you a little bit more time than the usual, but it's well worth it because the questions will essentially just ask about those takeaways, like what's the big conclusion? What would you recommend to a patient? Is this drug going to do the thing that you think it is? Those are all things that you draw from the data. And so the time balance ends up being, when you have an experimental passage, you upfront a little bit more time in the analysis in the passage, and you essentially just breeze through the questions because all of them are just going to ask you the same things that you've already been asking yourself when you're analyzing. So it's not that you're going to take extra time. It's just balancing a different distribution of timing with those passages. There was a great question that was describing how, and I think this really speaks to all of us, and we're almost out of time, but yeah, this one I really like.
We're not ready to go. We'll be here all day, right?
So somebody was asking, what do I do when I get those passages that essentially tie in all of these different topics in one? Like, I'm very much used to doing, physics classes and only having physics problems. So I got my physics brain here, and then I go to my Gen Chem class and I do my Gen Chem brain there. How do I kind of start mixing things up like it does on the MCAT?
Guys, welcome to the MCAT. Like, that's what the MCAT loves to do. It's what it wants to do. I would say part of that is just knowing that's expected on the MCAT, right? So expect multiple disciplines to come into a single passage. That's what the MCAT wants you to do. And then I think, when you get into the questions, just make sure you spend some time really defining the question, right? We call this the TRIM method in our course, to type, rephrase, investigate, match. And that kind of rephrase is really important. Make sure you spend the time to really think, what exactly is this question asking? And is the discipline that it appears to be asking really the principle, right, that I need to be applying? Or is it asking me to apply a new principle to this discipline? And that takes practice. That's easy to say. That takes practice. So part of it is just doing practice questions and slowing down and not worrying about the time and just forcing yourself to really rephrase and think through some questions so that you get really good at just breaking them down and going, oh, okay, this on the surface, this looks like, like a phase change question, but it's really a density question, right? And once you understand that, then you can put on that density hat or whatever, right? And tear it apart and dive into it.
I think we put artificial boundaries on what science is meant to be. We're like, oh, fluids really should be just
So
physics. And then, circuits really should, again, just be physics. But the reason why I brought those two Preston already knows the connection. The reason why I bring up those two examples is that they're almost never just like airplane movement and tank with water. They tested in the context of biology. So the circulatory system is a very common example of how that gets tested. And I think at one hand, that's challenging, right? Doing the application base of a science concept. But on the other hand, oh my gosh, so much more interesting than, what is the angle at which the clown leaves the cannon as it being fired from this at this. I despised questions like that because I was like, I literally have no use for this. Once they did it in the context of biology, though, it became more interesting, more applicable, more useful in the future. So continue to explore avenues. Actually, the more cross connections a topic has, the more likely it's going to be tested. For instance, magnetism is a topic on the MCAT, is listed in the EMC document, has 0 questions in the current set of practice coming from the EMC. Now, I'm not saying don't study magnetism, but you should lower the priority on that, which is a very dense topic, I'm not gonna lie. But also there's not a whole lot of ways you can tie that in if you're trying to look for a biological kind of direction for magnetism. Whereas electrostatics is honestly everywhere. Yeah.
And that's something, as you study, try to make those cross connections. That'll help you in that. But not only does it help you to get those questions, it deepens your understanding, it deepens your memory. Like Eric was saying, it makes it more interesting, and it'll help you understand these disciplines at a deeper level. So as you study, think about, how does this apply to biology, right? When you think about fluid dynamics, how does this make sense in the context of the circulatory system? And the more you challenge yourself to not just memorize, but to think about these topics, the more intuitive that's going to be, the deeper your learning will be, and honestly, the easier the MCAT will be, because that's what the MCAT wants you to do.
All I'm envisioning is people's like brain pathways just like expanding. Here, physics over here, and Gen Chem over here. Let's make a connection between them. We are at time, and I wish we had time to follow up on all the great questions that you had. So I do really appreciate all of your interactions and your questions and comments that you've made. I had a great time talking to Preston here. Preston, any final words? Drops of wisdom you can share with us.
Guys, this is just one step on your journey. And I know it sounds like weird to say like enjoy the journey when you're in the middle of like MCAT studying and you're stressed. And I know, because I did not particularly enjoy MCAT studying. It's stressful, right? Like I get it. But you are on such an amazing path, right? And don't lose sight of where that path leads you. And this is just one step on it. And you're going to have interviews, you're going to get into med schools, you're going to take your board exams, you're going to go residency, you're going to take special, like, frankly, this is just a regular part of the path that you're embarking on, is studying for and taking major exams that have big implications. And it is stressful, but that's okay. Develop good habits now, right? Like we've talked about, give yourself breaks, build study plans. I mentioned some of these things because I'm still doing them when I'm studying for my board exams and whatnot, right? Like, it's just part of how you learn. So get good at learning and love the material that you're learning. I know you're sitting there reading like OChem going like, this isn't really going to be in med school. And some of that's kind of true, but a lot of it is very applicable. As Ari talked about, they tied to biology. I think that's one of the big changes they made when they redid the MCAT 5 years ago, is they do a much better job tying it to biology. And so, let yourself be fascinated. Let yourself experience kind of wonder and enjoyment with the science as much as one can. I know, soapbox, whatever. But enjoy the journey, I guess is what I'm saying, including this part of it, because it's all interesting. And frankly, you're going to learn a ton of stuff in med school too that you're like, I'm never going to use this in my specialty, right? And it's probably true. But it's just part of enjoying learning and enjoying the path that you're on and embracing the challenge and rising up to it. And you guys are going to do that. You're going to be great. And I'm excited to see you guys in the hospitals and, in our MCAT classrooms and just all the amazing things you guys are going to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Preston. Thank you all for joining us. I do hope that you check out more future events and see you next time in a future session. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.